Well, when you think of all the clearances that took place from, roughly speaking, the 1750s onwards, or even before, because this idea of changing the idea of what is the land for, changing it from supporting the people who live on it to making a profit for the owner of the land, this really began in the 1750s in some areas close to the lowlands, even you might say in the 1740s. Now, if you suddenly clear a lot of people away out of the place they had been living, the question is, where did they go? And this is, for Orthodox historians, an embarrassing question, because they have to explain what happened to the people and why suddenly in the 1750s as opposed to the 1730s or the 1680s, why suddenly were hordes of people going to the coast, getting on ships, emigrant ships, and going across the Atlantic, which it was not a, shall we say, a wise thing to do, because those ships were very often fever carriers, and the number of people who got on the ship in the Highlands was not the same as the number of people who got off the ship when they got to the American continent. And furthermore, if you're living in the Highlands, in a settled place where you and your ancestors have been for centuries, and instead you're going into a completely, well, I was going to say completely empty, but a land inhabited only by what were then called Red Indians, who were regarded as almost subhuman and could be cleared away. No, it's up to us. We have conquered this land, we can settle there. You have to explain why this suddenly happened. And one answer given by Orthodox historians is because of overpopulation. There was no overpopulation, but if you're interested in how history is written, well, go along to your bookshop or go along to your library and get down the first 12 books you see which cover the history of the Highlands, and I bet everyone will talk about the overpopulation of the Highlands, which never happened. And of course, if you're talking about something which never happened, then obviously one thing that you avoid doing is actually talking about numbers. When I come along, not being an Orthodox historian, I started by adding up all the parish populations in 1750 or whatever, and then adding up all the parish populations after every 10 years, 1800, 1850 and so on. There was no overpopulation. In fact, if anything, it was grossly underpopulated. And if you read any traveller going up to the Highlands, the first thing they talk about is, not only, they talk about a deserted landscape. There's nobody there. So how an Orthodox historian can talk about overpopulation? He can only do it by ignoring all the evidence. And I'm afraid that's the first little skill you've got to develop, how to ignore the evidence. And of course it's much easier. You're coming along, let me see, you're a historian, you've got yourself a lovely new job at a university, possibly an old one, possibly a new one, and at such a university, the chap at the head of your department is probably looking at you and saying, what have you written? because very often that's what they want to know before you give you the job. What have you written? And it's no good saying, well, actually, I've just started on my history of the Highland clearances, and in 10 years, I can assure you, no, I don't want to hear about 10 years. Firstly, what have you written? And secondly, if you haven't actually published, what are you going to publish in the next 2 or 3 months? Okay, so you hastily go back to your desk and begin to write. Now, what's the quickest way to write a history book? And the answer is, you buy half a dozen other history books covering the same period, and you copy them out. And you may look at me and say, oh, people won't do that. Do you know, I've got a book, I don't like to actually indicate what it is exactly, but when I was reading it, I thought, this is very familiar. And after a bit of deep thought, I got another history book down off the shelf, and this really irritated me, because not only had he simply copied the facts, which is a terrible error, because it's up to you to decide whether it's true or not, he'd actually copied it in such a way that he had used the same phrases, the same clauses. He hadn't even altered it. You could see that this book had been opened on his desk, and he was copying it out directly. It's like when I was a teacher, I would get very annoyed if a couple of essays turned up, which has happened to me, which are word for word identical. And I've called the two of them up afterwards. I remember doing this. In fact, it was a class of mid-managers in their 20s. I called two of them up. I said, well, which one of you did this marvellous thing to start with, and which copied it? And I said, I remember copying other people's, but I was subtle. I changed the wording around. I said, there's only 17 in the class. Do you really think that I've got 17 essays, 2 of them identical, and I won't know? It's a kind of an insult to me as a teacher. Well, this is what actually happened. I've got the books indoors in my bookshelves. And the quickest way, you want your book, you've got your agreement with the publisher, and he's saying, how soon can I have that manuscript? And the quickest way to get a manuscript is to copy what everybody said. And if everybody said there was overpopulation in the Highlands, and that's why suddenly, halfway through the 18th century, as if somebody had clicked a switch, suddenly everybody was emigrating. What? Overpopulation. And it's going to take you a long time if, like me, you wasted all those years going through and adding up all the population figures. And I was doing this before I even had a calculator. So I had 162 figures to add up. And then you do it the second time, of course, to make sure it's right. And it's 1 or 2 different. So you have to do it a 3rd time and a 4th time before you get it right. So I can understand why people avoid doing it. But it's not the way to write history if you want it to be accurate. So this is where the idea of overpopulation comes in. It wasn't the overpopulation, it was the clearances. And in order to avoid giving any importance to the clearances, you talk about overpopulation. But the clearances were driving people away. What happened to them? Well, possibly 3 things. Either they stayed around as kind of odd extras looking for work where they'd once been small farmers, or they went down to the big industrial towns which were growing apace in the Scottish Lowlands and in England. I mean, places like Manchester, for example, 1700 small village, have a job finding it on the map. 1800, it's got thousands of people living there. So there was jobs going in factories, not very enticing jobs, 12 or 14 or 16 hours a day for rotten pay, living in a slum. It's not what you choose to do, but it was your job. It was, if the alternative was starving to death, that's what you would do. So staying around in the Highlands, going down the Scottish Highlands, or thirdly, as it happened in the 18th century, this new great state of Great Britain, the Scottish Highlands and England combined, were taking over, stealing, if you want, lands from the people who live there. The West Indies, for example, the British had gone there and landed and said, right, this belongs to us now, and had set up enormous plantations. And this, incidentally, is where slavery comes in. You want a lot of people to work on plantations, very hot weather because it's near the equator, but there's a growing demand firstly for sugar, and then there's a growing demand for cotton. And for all these things, you've got a plantation going. You can't get enough people to work in the ordinary way of it, so you send ships to Africa and you kidnap hundreds of people, throw them into your ship, which you can do because you've got a machine gun and they haven't. You've got rifles and cannon and they haven't. And you take them, you kidnap them and take them as slaves over to the other side of the Atlantic. And we're all getting very, well, I hope, apologetic about slavery now, because a lot of the money which kept the Industrial Revolution going, it's expensive to build a factory, came from the slave trade. And it was highly respectable. Highly respectable. Oh, Handel, for example, had a bit of spare cash. He put it in the South Sea Company, which was a slaving company, and you didn't have to apologize for it. That was where the money was. So that's what you invested in. So that was the third place I went to fill places in this newly growing empire overseas. At first it was what has now become the United States of America, particularly Carolina for some reason. Well, I say for some reason, if you're emigrating as a Highlander and you find that there are 1,000 Highlanders who have already gone to Carolina, well, that's where you would go. You've got some friends there, they'll show you what to do when you get there. So when you've once got a sizable population of immigrant Highlanders, you get more coming. So North and South Carolina, and then from 1771, and have I got the date? Yes, about 1771, there was a ship was taken out by a couple of entrepreneurs, as we can call them, people who'd bought land in what is now Canada, and they sent a chap to the Highlands to drum up custom, as it were, to tell people they'd all be prosperous if they went to Canada. They took them over on the Hector, as the ship was called, and they landed there, and they were the first people who'd gone that far north. And from then on, a lot more people went that far north, and that was the third place for the Highlanders to go. So there they are, staying around in the Highlands, going down to the Lowlands or England, and thirdly, going overseas to opportunities in the colonies. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. We're hoping to get more videos out in this of this kind, and if you did like it, please comment, tell us what you thought of it, and if you want to as it were join in, press the notification bell. Thank you.